The morning mist hung heavy over Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at her private study window, watching the early commuters hurry along the distant road. Her fingers traced the edge of a letter that had arrived just hours before, another report of families struggling to heat their homes, children going to school hungry, and elderly people choosing between medicine and meals. The economic crisis had hit Britain harder than anyone anticipated. What started as post-pandemic recovery challenges had snowballed into something far more serious. Inflation soared, energy costs skyrocketed, and unemployment figures painted a grim picture across the nation. The government's response felt inadequate to many, and public frustration was mounting daily. Catherine had always taken her royal duties seriously, but lately, something deeper stirred within her. The carefully crafted public appearances and ribbon-cutting ceremonies felt hollow when she knew millions of her fellow citizens were genuinely suffering. She thought about the single mother she'd met last month during a charity visit, a woman working 3 jobs just to keep her family afloat, her eyes filled with exhaustion and worry. Her husband, William, found her there an hour later, still holding the letter. He knew that look, the same determined expression she'd worn when she decided to champion early childhood development, despite palace advisors suggesting it was too complex an issue for a royal to tackle. "Another difficult morning briefing?" William asked gently, settling into the chair beside her desk. Catherine turned from the window, her green eyes reflecting both sadness and resolve. "William, when did we become so removed from what people are actually experiencing? When did our role become just showing up and waving?" The question hung between them like a challenge. William understood her frustration. He felt it too. But he also knew the delicate balance they had to maintain as working royals. Too much involvement in political matters could create constitutional problems. Too little, and they risked becoming irrelevant figureheads. "The advisors will say we need to be careful," William replied, though his tone suggested he was wrestling with the same thoughts. Careful of what? Of actually caring? Catherine's voice carried an edge he rarely heard. Of using whatever influence we have to help people who are genuinely desperate? She moved to her desk and pulled out a folder thick with correspondence. Letters from teachers reporting children fainting from hunger. Messages from veterans unable to afford basic necessities. Stories from families facing homelessness despite working full-time jobs. "Look at these, William. Really look at them." She spread several letters across the mahogany surface. "These aren't statistics in a government report. These are real people, and they're writing to us because they believe we might actually care enough to help." William read through several of the letters, his expression growing more serious with each one. One particularly heart-wrenching note came from a grandmother raising her grandchildren alone, describing how she pretended to not be hungry so the children could eat. "The traditional approach isn't working," Catherine continued, her voice gaining strength. "Quiet diplomacy behind closed doors. Careful words that offend no one but inspire nobody. Meanwhile, people are suffering in silence, losing hope that anything will change." She had spent weeks researching, quietly reaching out to grassroots, organizations and community leaders. What she discovered painted a picture far more dire than official reports suggested. Food banks running empty, domestic violence spiking as stress levels soared, and a growing sense that the establishment, including the monarchy, was out of touch with ordinary people's struggles. "I've been thinking about Queen Elizabeth during the Blitz," Catherine said, moving back to the window. "She didn't just make safe diplomatic statements. She and the King stayed in London, shared the danger with their people, spoke directly to their hearts." William joined her at the window, understanding where her thoughts were leading. "That was wartime, Catherine. Different rules, different expectations. But isn't this a kind of war too?" she asked. "A war against poverty, against despair, against the feeling that no one in power actually cares about ordinary families?" The room fell quiet except for the steady tick of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Catherine could almost feel the weight of centuries of royal protocol pressing down on her shoulders, reminding her of boundaries and limitations. But stronger still was the pull she felt toward something more meaningful, more urgent. "What are you proposing?" William asked finally, though he already suspected the answer would change everything. Catherine turned to face him fully, and he saw in her expression the same determination that had made her refuse to be just another decorative royal wife. I want to speak directly to the nation, not through carefully vetted statements or pre-approved interviews. I want to acknowledge what's really happening and call on everyone, government, business leaders, communities, individuals, to step up. The palace will never approve that kind of direct political involvement, William warned, though his tone carried more curiosity than discouragement. Then maybe it's time to ask for forgiveness rather than permission, Catherine replied, her voice steady with newfound resolve. Maybe it's time to remember that our role isn't just ceremonial. Maybe it's time to actually lead. Outside the window, the morning traffic had thickened, thousands of people heading to jobs that might not pay enough to live on, facing daily choices between necessities that should be basic rights. Catherine watched them and felt the weight of possibility and responsibility settling over her like a mantle she was finally ready to wear. The emergency meeting at Buckingham Palace felt more like a tribunal than a family discussion. King Charles sat at the head of the polished conference table, his expression carefully neutral, while senior advisors filled the remaining chairs. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed harsh, casting sharp shadows across faces that had grown increasingly tense over the past hour. Catherine sat straight-backed, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes held the quiet fire of someone who had made up her mind and wouldn't be easily swayed. Beside her, William maintained his diplomatic composure, though those who knew him well could see the internal struggle playing out in the set of his jaw. "Your Royal Highness," began Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary, his voice carrying decades of experience in managing royal crises. "We must consider the constitutional implications of what you're proposing. The monarchy's political neutrality has been carefully maintained for generations." "With respect, Sir Clive," Catherine responded, her voice calm but firm. "Speaking about poverty and human suffering isn't political. It's humanitarian." The Queen Consort Camilla leaned forward slightly. "Catherine, dear, we all understand your compassion. But there are proper channels, established ways of addressing these concerns without creating constitutional complications." Catherine had anticipated these arguments. She'd spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment, knowing that tradition and protocol would be weaponized against her good intentions, but she'd also done her homework. "What proper channels?" Catherine asked, her voice gaining strength. "The ones that have allowed the situation to deteriorate to this point? The ones that produce carefully worded statements expressing concern, while people choose between heating and eating?" She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a folder filled with research. "I've studied every major speech by the royal family over the past 5 years. Do you know how many times we've directly addressed the cost of living crisis affecting millions of our people?" 0. The room grew uncomfortable at her directness. Palace staff weren't accustomed to such challenges from working royals, especially delivered with such quiet conviction. King Charles finally spoke, his voice measured and thoughtful. "Catherine, your passion is admirable, and your concern for our people is exactly what we should expect from a future queen. But you must understand the delicate balance we maintain." "I understand perfectly, Your Majesty," Catherine replied, using his formal title deliberately. "I understand that we live in palaces while families sleep in cars. I understand that we attend state banquets while children go to school hungry. I understand that we worry about constitutional implications while real people face impossible choices every single day." The silence that followed was deafening. Several advisors exchanged meaningful glances, clearly calculating the potential fallout from Catherine's words. William finally broke the silence. "Perhaps we could discuss a compromise. A carefully crafted message that expresses concern while maintaining appropriate boundaries." Catherine turned to her husband, her disappointment evident. "A compromise? William, when someone is drowning, you don't compromise, you throw them a lifeline." She stood and moved to the window overlooking the palace gardens, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched toward the distance. The irony wasn't lost on her, debating whether to help struggling families while surrounded by centuries of accumulated wealth and privilege. I've received over 3,000 letters in the past month, Catherine continued, her back still to the room. Personal appeals from people who believe the royal family might actually care about their struggles. They write to us because politicians have failed them, because institutions have failed them, because they're desperate enough to hope that someone, anyone, with influence might listen. She turned back to face the room, her eyes bright with unshed tears that she refused to let fall. I can't sit in this palace, surrounded by luxury, and pretend I don't know about their suffering. I won't reduce their pain to carefully worded statements approved by committee. The communications secretary, Sarah Mitchell, cleared her throat, nervously. Your Royal Highness, if I may, public sentiment is indeed concerning. Our latest polling shows trust in institutions at historic lows. Perhaps there's an opportunity to address this carefully. Carefully, Catherine repeated, the word tasting bitter. Always carefully. Never boldly. Never with the kind of moral clarity that might actually inspire people or create real change. King Charles stood and walked to join Catherine at the window. For a moment, father-in-law and daughter-in-law stood side by side, looking out at the world beyond the palace walls. You know, Charles said quietly. His voice meant only for Catherine. Your mother-in-law faced similar criticism when she wanted to speak out about landmines. The establishment said it was too political, too controversial. Catherine looked at him with surprise. This wasn't the response she'd expected. Diana changed the world with that campaign. Charles continued, still speaking softly, but she paid a price for challenging expectations, for refusing to stay within prescribed boundaries. The implication hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Catherine understood he was warning her about the personal cost of public defiance, but she also heard something else. Perhaps a grudging respect for her determination. Your Majesty, Catherine said, matching his quiet tone. With respect, I'm not Diana. I'm not trying to change the world through controversy or rebellion. I'm simply trying to use whatever influence I have to help people who are genuinely suffering. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But I am willing to pay whatever price comes with doing what's right. Charles studied her face for a long moment, seeing something that reminded him powerfully of his late first wife's fierce compassion, but tempered with a steadiness that was uniquely Catherine's own. Very well, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decision. What exactly do you propose? The television studio felt smaller than Catherine had expected, its bright lights creating an intimate space that would soon connect her with millions of viewers across the nation. She had insisted on a simple setup, no elaborate throne room, backdrop, or formal palace setting. Instead, she sat in a comfortable chair against a backdrop that suggested home rather than institution. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, but her heart raced with the magnitude of what she was about to do. This wasn't a pre-recorded message that could be edited and polished. This was live television, broadcast during prime time, with no safety net of palace handlers controlling every word. The makeup artist applied final touches while Catherine reviewed her notes one last time. Not that she needed them. She had lived with these words for weeks, refining them, feeling their weight, understanding their power to inspire or create controversy. 2 minutes, Your Royal Highness. The floor, manager announced softly. Catherine closed her eyes briefly, thinking about the letters that had brought her to this moment. The single mother working 3 jobs. The elderly couple rationing medication. The veteran sleeping rough despite serving his country with honor. Their faces had become her North Star, guiding her through weeks of palace negotiations and public criticism. The red light on the camera came to life, and suddenly Catherine was speaking directly to the nation, her voice steady and warm despite the revolutionary nature of her words. Good evening. I'm speaking to you tonight not from a palace or a formal setting, but as someone who shares your concerns about the challenges facing our country. She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. Over recent months, I've received thousands of letters from families across Britain. Letters that have kept me awake at night, because they describe a reality that too many people are living. A reality where working full-time doesn't guarantee being able to afford basic necessities. The camera captured every nuance of her expression as she spoke without notes, her words flowing from genuine emotion rather than scripted talking points. I've met the nurse who skips meals so her children can eat. I've spoken with the grandfather, who sits in the cold because he can't afford to heat his home and buy his medication. I've listened to the teacher who spends her own money on breakfast for students because she knows some of them won't eat otherwise. Catherine's voice grew stronger, more passionate as she continued. These aren't statistics in a government report. These are our neighbors, our fellow citizens, people who work hard and deserve better than having to choose between heating and eating. The studio was utterly quiet, except for her voice, the camera operators and crew clearly recognizing they were witnessing something unprecedented in royal broadcasting. For too long, we've accepted that poverty and struggle are inevitable parts of life for millions of people. We've become comfortable with inequality, with the idea that some people deserve abundance, while others deserve barely enough to survive. Renaud leaned forward slightly, her eyes seeming to look directly at each viewer through their television screens. But I don't accept that. I refuse to believe that in one of the world's wealthiest nations, children should go to bed hungry, or families should face homelessness despite working multiple jobs. The words that came next would be replayed and analyzed for years to come, becoming the defining moment of Catherine's public life. So tonight, I'm not just speaking to you as a member of the royal family. I'm speaking to you as someone who believes we can do better. We must do better. I'm calling on every person watching, whether you're a government minister, a business leader, a community volunteer, or simply someone with a few pounds to spare, to rise up and take action. She stood from her chair, a movement that hadn't been planned but felt necessary for the weight of what she was saying. Rise up against the indifference that allows suffering to continue unchallenged. Rise up against the systems that prioritize profit over people. Rise up against the idea that someone else will solve these problems. Her voice rang with conviction that surprised even her most supportive advisors watching from the palace. Every empty stomach is our responsibility. Every cold home is our failure. Every family forced to choose between necessities is a moral challenge we must meet together. Catherine returned to her seat, but her posture remained upright, dignified yet approachable. I'm not asking you to wait for government solutions or institutional changes. I'm asking you to act now, today, in whatever way you can. If you own a business, pay living wages. If you have influence, use it to help others. If you have resources, share them with those who have less. The camera captured a slight tremor in her voice as she reached the most personal part of her message. Some will say this isn't appropriate for a member of the royal family to say. Some will argue that we should stay above such matters, maintain our traditional distance from difficult realities. She paused, her eyes reflecting years of careful consideration. But I believe our role, my role, is not to stand apart from the struggles of our people, but to stand with them, not to offer empty sympathy from a comfortable distance, but to use whatever privilege and platform we have to make a real difference. The final moments of her speech carried the weight of history, the sense that something fundamental was shifting in the relationship between the monarchy and the people it served. The letters I receive end with the same phrase, "Please help us." Tonight I'm turning that request back to all of us. Please help each other. Please rise up. Please remember that we are one nation, and we rise or fall together. As the red light dimmed, Catherine remained seated for a moment, knowing that her life, and perhaps the monarchy itself, would never be the same. The silence in the studio was profound, broken only by scattered applause from the crew who had forgotten their professional neutrality. In homes across Britain, millions of people sat transfixed, many wiping away tears, others reaching for their phones to call friends and family, all of them recognizing they had witnessed something extraordinary. The future queen had not just spoken to them, she had called them to action, challenged them to be better, and shown them that even institutions built on tradition could evolve when faced with moral imperative. The aftermath hit like a tidal wave. Within minutes of Catherine's broadcast ending, social media exploded with reactions that ranged from passionate support to outraged condemnation. The hashtag #YourRiseUpBritain began trending worldwide while opposing voices rallied around a car Know Your Place, demanding the princess remember her constitutional position. In the private apartments at Kensington Palace, Catherine sat with William, both their phones buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, palace officials, and political figures. The television remained on, cycling through news channels where talking heads debated the implications of what many were calling the most significant royal intervention in politics since the abdication crisis. "The Prime Minister's office has called 3 times, William said, his voice tight with stress. "The leader of the opposition twice. Half the cabinet want meetings, and the other half are calling for investigations into constitutional breaches." Catherine listened to the list with surprising calm. She had expected the political establishment to react strongly, but she hadn't anticipated the sheer speed and intensity of the response. BBC News at 10 was leading with her speech, the anchor's expression grave as she introduced a panel of constitutional experts, political commentators, and historians. Catherine reached for the remote to increase the volume. "This is unprecedented," declared Professor Margaret Thornley, a constitutional law expert from Oxford. "Not since the 1930s has a senior royal taken such a direct political stance. The implications could be profound." The opposing panelist, former Conservative MP Sir James Wickham, looked visibly agitated. "The Princess of Wales has overstepped every boundary of constitutional monarchy. She's essentially declared war on government policy, while speaking from a position of inherited privilege." But the third panelist, Dr. Amara Okafor, a social policy researcher, offered a different perspective. "Perhaps we should ask why a member of the royal family felt compelled to speak out. When institutions fail people this dramatically, sometimes moral leadership has to come from unexpected places." Catherine muted the television as her private secretary knocked on the door. Emma Peterson entered looking frazzled, carrying a tablet displaying the latest polling numbers and social media analytics. "Ma'am, the public response is complicated," Emma began carefully. "Support is running about 65% positive, but it's deeply polarized along political and generational lines." She showed Catherine the screen displaying real-time data. Younger voters are overwhelmingly supportive. Comments like "finally, someone who gets it and this is what real leadership looks like" are everywhere. But traditional conservative voters are expressing serious concerns about constitutional propriety. William studied the data over Catherine's shoulder. "What about the international reaction?" "Mixed, but largely positive," Emma replied. "The American networks are calling it refreshingly authentic leadership. The European press is fascinated. But some Commonwealth nations are expressing concerns about the precedent it sets." Catherine's phone buzzed with a text from her mother, Carol Middleton. "Watched your speech. So proud of you for speaking your truth. Dad says you reminded him why he still believes in public service." The message brought the first smile Catherine had felt since stepping out of the television studio. Whatever happened next, her family understood why she had taken this risk. "Ma'am," Emma continued hesitantly, "there's something else. The palace switchboard has been overwhelmed. Not with complaints, with offers of help. Businesses wanting to donate, individuals asking how they can contribute, community groups organizing local responses." This was news Catherine hadn't expected. "What kind of offers?" "Everything from major corporations pledging emergency food supplies to primary school children organizing bake sales. A group of celebrities announced they're creating a fund to help families with energy bills. 3 major supermarket chains have committed to expanding their community support programs." William looked surprised. "That fast?" The speech was only 2 hours ago. "Social media has accelerated everything," Emma explained. "People are sharing stories, organizing locally, creating support networks in real time. It's like your speech gave them permission to care openly." Catherine felt a flutter of hope mixed with the anxiety. Perhaps the risk had been worth it if real help was reaching people who needed it, but the hope was tempered by Emma's next update. "However, ma'am, the political backlash is intensifying. There are calls for parliamentary debate about the role of the monarchy. Some MPs are suggesting you should be stripped of royal duties until you clarify your constitutional position." The phone rang, a direct line that only the most senior royals used for urgent matters. William answered, his face growing pale as he listened. That was my father, he said after hanging up. Emergency Privy Council meeting tomorrow morning. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the Prime Minister, and senior constitutional advisors will all attend. Catherine felt the weight of consequence settling over her. She had known this moment would come. The formal response from the establishment, the price demanded for her defiance of expected boundaries. Are you having second thoughts? William asked gently, though his own expression suggested he was struggling with similar doubts. Catherine walked to the window overlooking Kensington Gardens. Even at this late hour she could see people walking, some alone, some in small groups. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, many of them touched by the struggles she had addressed just hours before. No, she said firmly. If anything, I'm more convinced we did the right thing. She turned back to William and Emma. Show me more of the positive responses. I want to know exactly how people are helping each other. Emma scrolled through her tablet, reading excerpts from the flood of responses. A group of doctors in Manchester announced they're creating free health clinics. Teachers in Birmingham are organizing weekend meal programs. Construction workers in Newcastle are volunteering to help families winterize their homes. Each example strengthened Catherine's resolve. This is what I hoped for. People not waiting for someone else to solve problems, but stepping up themselves. But ma'am, Emma said carefully, the constitutional crisis is real. Tomorrow's meeting could result in significant restrictions on your future role. Catherine nodded, understanding the stakes. Then we need to be ready to defend not just what I said, but why I said it. And we need to show them that sometimes moral leadership requires taking risks that comfortable people find uncomfortable. As the night wore on, the phones continued ringing. The news channels continued analyzing, and across Britain, millions of people continued responding to a call they had never expected to hear from a princess. A call to rise up, take action, and remember their shared humanity. The revolution Catherine had started with 15 minutes of television was no longer just her own. It belonged to everyone who had heard her message and decided to answer it. The Privy Council meeting convened at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, behind the imposing doors of Windsor Castle's oak-paneled council chamber. Catherine entered to find herself facing a semicircle of Britain's most powerful figures. The Prime Minister, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Chancellor, senior judges, and constitutional experts whose combined centuries of experience seemed to weigh heavily in the formal atmosphere. King Charles sat at the head of the ancient table, his expression carefully neutral, while William took a seat to Catherine's right, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by anyone present. The Prime Minister, Sarah Henderson, spoke first, her voice measured but clearly strained. Your Royal Highness, your broadcast last night has created what I can only describe as a constitutional emergency. We need to understand your intentions and establish clear boundaries going forward. Catherine had prepared for this moment during sleepless hours, but facing the assembled power of the British establishment still felt overwhelming. She drew strength from the memory of the letters that had started this journey. Real people with real struggles who deserved more than political maneuvering. Prime Minister, with respect, the only emergency I see is millions of families struggling to survive in one of the world's wealthiest nations, Catherine replied, her voice steady, despite the gravity of the moment. The Lord Chancellor, Sir Michael, Pemberton leaned forward disapprovingly. Your Royal Highness, the monarchy's political neutrality is fundamental to our constitutional system. Your speech effectively criticized government policy and called for political action. I called for human compassion, Catherine corrected. I asked people to help their neighbors. If that's political, then perhaps our definition of politics needs examining. Archbishop Williams unexpectedly spoke in her defense. The princess raises a valid point. Calling for charity and community support has always been within the royal family's purview. Perhaps we should distinguish between partisan politics and moral leadership. The Prime Minister's expression sharpened, but the language used, rise up, systems that prioritize profit over people, this went far beyond traditional charitable appeals. It was revolutionary rhetoric. Revolutionary? Catherine's voice carried a note of incredulity. Is it revolutionary? To suggest that no child should go hungry? That working people should afford basic necessities? These used to be shared values across political divides. Sir Michael consulted his notes with obvious disapproval. The constitutional issue remains clear. Senior royals cannot advocate for specific policy positions or criticize elected government approaches, however indirectly. William finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of his future kingship. But surely there's a difference between supporting a political party and supporting struggling people? The princess didn't endorse any particular solution. She asked everyone to take personal responsibility. King Charles had remained silent throughout the opening exchanges, but now he commanded attention simply by straightening in his chair. Perhaps we should examine what has actually happened since the broadcast. What concrete effects have resulted from the princess's words? Catherine's private secretary, who had been quietly taking notes, consulted her tablet. Your Majesty, the response has been extraordinary. Over 50,000 people have registered to volunteer with food banks since last night. Donations to poverty relief charities have increased by 300%. Community groups across the country are organizing immediate assistance programs. She continued reading from her screen. Major employers including Tesco, Sainsbury's, and British Telecom have announced expansion of their employee support programs. The National Health Service reports increased offers of volunteer support. Even local councils are reporting unprecedented community engagement. The Prime Minister looked uncomfortable. While charitable response is welcome, this doesn't address the constitutional breach. The princess cannot use her platform to essentially declare government policy inadequate. Did I mention government policy? Catherine asked. Did I criticize any specific minister or party? Or did I simply describe the reality that millions of people are living and ask everyone, including government, to do more? The constitutional expert Professor Elizabeth Manning, who had been silent until now, cleared her throat. If I may, there is historical precedent for royal intervention during national crises. Queen Elizabeth's wartime broadcasts weren't politically neutral. They called for specific actions and attitudes from the public. That was wartime, Sir Michael objected. And this isn't a crisis? Catherine asked. Food bank usage at record levels, homelessness increasing, children in poverty. If this isn't an emergency worthy of leadership, what is? The Archbishop nodded thoughtfully. The princess makes a compelling moral argument. Perhaps our concern should be not whether she spoke, but whether she needed to speak because other institutions had failed to adequately address these issues. The room fell silent at this implicit criticism of government effectiveness. The Prime Minister's aide whispered urgently in her ear, while several council members exchanged meaningful glances. King Charles finally broke the silence. It seems to me we face a choice. We can focus on constitutional technicalities while people suffer, or we can ask how the monarchy can best serve the nation during difficult times. He looked directly at Catherine. Princess, if you were to continue speaking publicly about social issues, how would you propose to maintain constitutional appropriateness? Catherine had hoped for this opening. Your Majesty, I propose complete transparency. Announce that I will focus my royal duties on poverty relief and community support. Make it clear that this work transcends party politics, that every MP, regardless of affiliation, is invited to join these efforts. The Prime Minister frowned. That puts enormous political pressure on government ministers. Good, Catherine replied simply. Perhaps political pressure is exactly what's needed when children are going hungry. The boldness of her response created another tense silence. Finally, Professor Manning spoke again. There is actually a constitutional mechanism for this. If the princess's role were formally defined as focusing on social welfare, it would provide clear boundaries while allowing her to continue this work. William leaned forward. A formal appointment as perhaps royal advocate for community welfare. It would be unprecedented, but it would legitimize the role while maintaining constitutional boundaries. The Archbishop smiled slightly. It would also provide a framework for measuring success. The princess could report annually on progress in addressing poverty and social issues. King Charles studied the faces around the table, clearly weighing options and consequences. Prime Minister, would such an arrangement be acceptable to government? Sarah Henderson conferred quietly with her advisors before responding. It would be irregular, but given the public response and assuming clear protocols were established, it might be workable. Catherine felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. I want to be clear about one thing. This isn't about creating a comfortable role that allows everyone to feel good while changing nothing. If I accept this position, I intend to use it effectively, which means continuing to challenge complacency wherever I find it. The Lord Chancellor looked alarmed, but King Charles smiled. The first genuine smile Catherine had seen from him that morning. I would expect nothing less, he said. The question is whether the establishment is ready for a princess who takes her duty to serve the people as seriously as she takes constitutional protocol. 6 months later, Catherine stood in a community center in Oldham, surrounded by families whose lives had been transformed by the movement that began with her televised call to action. The formal announcement of her role as royal advocate for community welfare had been met with initial skepticism from political observers, but the result spoke louder than any constitutional debate. The mother standing beside her, Maria Santos, had been one of those who wrote desperate letters to the Yao Palace the previous winter. Now Maria managed a thriving community kitchen that fed over 200 families weekly, funded by donations that flowed from Catherine's speech and sustained by volunteers who answered her call to rise up. Your Royal Highness, Maria said, her voice filled with emotion. My children used to ask why we couldn't afford proper meals. Now they help serve food to other families. You didn't just help us survive, you helped us find purpose. Catherine smiled, remembering the fear she'd felt walking into that television studio, unsure whether her words would create positive change or constitutional chaos. The answer had exceeded her most optimistic hopes. The statistics told part of the story. Food bank usage had decreased for the first time in a decade. Emergency accommodation requests had dropped by 30%. Most remarkably, community volunteering had increased by over 400%, creating a network of local support that no government program could have matched. But the numbers only captured part of the transformation. What Catherine witnessed in communities across Britain was something deeper, a revival of the idea that citizens had responsibilities to each other that transcended political divisions or economic status. The thing is, said James McKenna, an unemployed construction worker who now coordinated volunteer services across 3 northern towns, when the princess spoke that night, it wasn't just about giving money or food. She was saying we all matter. We all have something to contribute. Catherine had learned to value these conversations more than any formal ceremony or state occasion. Real change happened in community centers and school halls, not in palace meetings or parliamentary debates. Her phone buzzed with a message from William. PM's office confirms child poverty down 15% this quarter. Even the critics are running out of complaints. The political landscape had indeed shifted dramatically. The initial constitutional crisis had given way to grudging acceptance, then growing support as results became undeniable. Even opposition politicians found it difficult to criticize efforts that were demonstrably helping their own constituents. More importantly, Catherine's example had inspired action far beyond Britain's borders. Similar grassroots movements had emerged across Europe, with royals and political leaders worldwide grappling with how to balance traditional protocol against urgent social needs. Ma'am, called Emma Peterson, approaching with her ever-present tablet, the latest polling shows 87% approval for your work as royal advocate. More significantly, trust in the monarchy has reached its highest level in 25 years. Catherine nodded, though public approval had never been her primary concern. What mattered more was the elderly gentleman she'd met earlier that day, who told her he no longer had to choose between heating and medication because his community had organized a support network for seniors. As the afternoon progressed, Catherine participated in the kind of engagement that had become typical of her new role. Rather than ribbon-cutting ceremonies or formal receptions, she spent time in working sessions with community leaders, policy experts, and the people directly affected by poverty and social exclusion. The traditional approach to royal visits was all wrong, she reflected during a quiet moment with local organizers. Arriving for an hour, making pleasant conversation, then leaving. What did that actually accomplish? Real change requires real relationships, sustained engagement, genuine understanding. Dr. Sarah Ahmed, a social worker who had become one of Catherine's key advisors, smiled at the comment. You've revolutionized more than just royal protocol, ma'am. You've changed how people think about social responsibility. The idea that we're all accountable for each other's well-being, that's become mainstream in a way I never thought possible. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Catherine had faced sustained criticism from traditionalists who argued she had politicized the monarchy beyond repair. Some constitutional experts continued to warn about dangerous precedents. A few political commentators regularly accused her of overstepping her role, but the criticism had largely been overwhelmed by results that even skeptics couldn't dismiss. When child poverty statistics improved for the first time in a decade, when community cohesion strengthened visibly, when charitable giving reached record levels, constitutional concerns seemed increasingly academic. The most surprising support had come from unexpected quarters. Business leaders who initially worried about criticism of profit-focused policies had discovered that supporting community welfare initiatives actually improved their public standing and employee loyalty. Conservative politicians found that backing Catherine's work helped them connect with voters who had grown cynical about traditional political approaches. As evening approached, Catherine prepared for her monthly radio address, another innovation that had emerged from her new role. Unlike the carefully scripted royal broadcasts of the past, these were conversational, direct, and focused on practical updates about community initiatives and social progress. Good evening, she began, settling into the community center's makeshift radio studio. I'm speaking to you tonight from Oldham, where I've spent the day with families and volunteers who prove every day that when people work together, extraordinary things become possible. She spoke without notes, as had become her trademark. 6 months ago, I asked all of you to rise up, to take personal responsibility for helping your neighbors and communities. Tonight, I want to share what you've accomplished together. The statistics she shared painted a picture of national transformation that went far beyond policy changes or government programs. Food bank usage is down, but more importantly, community kitchens are up. Emergency accommodation requests have decreased, but neighborhood support networks have flourished. Children are eating better. Families are more secure, and communities are stronger. Catherine paused, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Some people told me that speaking out would damage the monarchy, that challenging, comfortable assumptions would undermine traditional authority. They were wrong about the damage, but they were right about the challenge. Her voice carried conviction earned through months of sustained effort and measurable results. We have challenged the assumption that poverty is inevitable, that inequality is natural, that some people deserve comfort while others deserve struggle. We've proven that when people are called to their best selves, they respond magnificently. As she concluded the broadcast, Catherine felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that mattered. The letters that had started her journey still arrived daily, but now they were filled with gratitude and stories of transformation rather than desperation and pleas for help. The drive back to London took her through communities where she could see the physical evidence of change. New community gardens, renovated community centers, schools where breakfast programs ensured no child started the day hungry. Each site reminded her why she had been willing to risk constitutional crisis for the chance to create real impact. William met her at Kensington Palace with the children, who were eager to hear about her day. As she tucked them into bed, her daughter asked the question that had become routine. "Mummy, did you help people today?" "We all helped people today," Catherine replied, kissing her goodnight. "That's what we do. We help each other rise up." Later, that evening, as she reviewed plans for the following week's engagements, Catherine reflected on how completely her life and role had changed. The nervous princess who had worried about constitutional boundaries seemed like someone from another lifetime. In her place was a woman who had discovered that true leadership meant being willing to risk everything for the chance to serve something greater than yourself. The letter on her desk was from a young teacher in Wales, thanking her for inspiring a generation of students to believe they could make a difference in their communities. It was exactly the kind of response that made every moment of controversy, every constitutional debate, every risk she had taken, completely worthwhile. Catherine smiled, filed the letter with thousands of others, and began planning tomorrow's work. There were still communities to visit, still problems to address, still people who needed to know that someone with influence actually cared about their struggles. The revolution that had begun with 15 minutes of television continued every day, one conversation at a time, one community at a time, one life at a time. And Catherine had never been more certain that she was exactly where she belonged.